300 hardened Viet Cong veterans. 300. In a single night, they abandoned a fortified camp, threw down their weapons, and fled into the jungle, without firing a single shot in return. For years, declassified Pentagon reports dismissed this incident as an intelligence error. Because soldiers who had survived hell simply do not run without a fight. But the list of items found at the site tells a different story. There were no booby traps. Instead, there were small pouches containing human teeth, white funeral ribbons tied to branches, and audio recordings that made prisoners' ears bleed. The real reason an entire battalion lost its mind in a matter of hours wasn't a new superweapon. It was hidden. In an old grandmother's tale, the Viet Cong fighter found the body at dawn, and what he saw made him forget every lesson about discipline and silence. His comrade hung suspended between two trees, arms spread wide like a crucifix, eyes open and staring at nothing. But it was not the corpse itself that sent ice through his veins. It was what had been done to it. The boots had been removed and placed neatly beside the body, their soles sliced clean through in a pattern that meant nothing to any Western observer, but everything to a Vietnamese peasant raised on ghost stories. Around the neck hung a playing card, the Ace of Spades. But this was no American calling card. This was something far older, far more terrifying. The body bore no visible wounds, no bullet holes, no shrapnel marks. It appeared as though the man had simply stopped living, as though something had reached inside him and switched off his life like a lamp. The fighter ran. He ran so fast and so far that when he finally reached his unit, he could barely speak. And when he did speak, his commander wished he had remained silent, because the words that came out of that young fighter's mouth would spread through the Viet Cong network like wildfire, would reach Hanoi within 72 hours, and would eventually force the North Vietnamese High Command to issue an official directive addressing what they called superstitious panic among their forces. The directive would fail completely, because you cannot order men to stop being afraid of ghosts. This is the story that the Pentagon buried for 50 years. This is the account of how 500 Australian SAS operators achieved what 500,000 American troops could not. This is the chronicle of men who learned to weaponize fear itself, who turned the jungle into a haunted house, and who convinced an entire enemy army that demons walked among the rubber trees of Phuoc-Tuy province. And this is the truth about why, to this very day, elderly Vietnamese in certain villages will not enter the forest after dark. The year was 1966, and Australia had a problem. The government in Canberra had committed ground forces to Vietnam, but unlike their American allies, the Australians could not simply throw bodies at the conflict. The entire Australian army numbered barely 40,000 men, a fraction of what the Americans could deploy from a single state. Every casualty would be felt. Every loss would make headlines in Sydney and Melbourne. The Australian public, already skeptical of the war, would not tolerate the kind of attrition rates the Americans seemed willing to accept. So the brass in Canberra gave their Special Forces commanders a simple directive, though simple is perhaps the wrong word. Impossible would be more accurate. Hold Phuoc-Tuy province, deny it to the enemy, keep Australian casualties to an absolute minimum, and do it with roughly 500 men against an estimated 5,000 Viet Cong operating in the area. The mathematics were absurd. The Americans, with their massive numerical superiority, their helicopter gunships, their B-52 bombers, their seemingly unlimited resources, were struggling to hold territory. How could a handful of Australians hope to succeed where the mightiest military machine in history was failing? The answer walked out of the bush 3 weeks later, wearing a floppy hat, carrying a worn Owen gun, and smelling like he had not bathed in a month. His name is still classified, but the men who served with him called him simply the Tracker. He was a sergeant in the Australian SAS, a former jackaroo from Queensland who had spent his youth hunting feral pigs in the outback. He had been in Vietnam for 6 months, and in that time he had developed a theory. The Americans, he argued, were fighting the wrong war. They treated Vietnam like a conventional conflict, seeking pitched battles, measuring success in body counts, believing that enough firepower could solve any problem. But the Viet Cong were not a conventional army. They were ghosts. They appeared from nowhere, struck hard, and vanished back into the jungle before the Americans could bring their superior firepower to bear. The solution, this sergeant argued, was not to outgun the enemy. It was to out-ghost them. It was to become something so terrifying, so inexplicable, so utterly beyond their understanding, that they would flee before a single shot was fired. But this was only the first whisper of what would become the most controversial psychological operation of the entire Vietnam War. The sergeant's proposal landed on the desk of Lieutenant Colonel John Essex Clark, commander of the Australian task force, and what happened next would never appear in any official report. Essex Clark was a practical man, a veteran of Malaya and Borneo, where Australian forces had already learned that unconventional wars required unconventional solutions. He read the proposal twice, then summoned his intelligence officer. The conversation lasted 4 hours. When it ended, a new unit designation appeared in the task force records, buried so deep in administrative paperwork that it would take historians decades to find it. The unit had no official name. The men who served in it called it the Ghost Patrol. And its mission was unlike anything the Australian military had ever attempted. The theory behind the operation was deceptively simple, but psychologically sophisticated. The Viet Cong were not professional soldiers in the Western sense. Many were peasants, farmers, villagers who had taken up arms against what they saw as foreign invaders. They came from rural communities where ancestor worship was not merely a tradition, but a living reality. Ghosts were not metaphors to these men. Spirits were as real as the trees and the rivers. The dead did not simply cease to exist. They lingered, watched, and could be angered. Vietnamese folklore was filled with tales of ma, restless spirits who haunted the places where they had perished violently. A soldier who fell in battle without proper burial rites was condemned to wander forever, bringing misfortune to anyone who crossed his path. The Viet Cong High Command, dominated by communist ideologues, officially dismissed such beliefs as feudal superstition. But the fighters in the field, the young men crouching in tunnels and sleeping in the jungle, had not read Marx. They had grown up with their grandmothers' stories about the spirits in the forest. The Australians were about to give those grandmothers' stories teeth. The first phase of Operation Ghost Battalion, as historians would later name it, began in March of 1966. Teams of SAS operators, typically 4 or 5 men, began deploying into the jungle on what were officially classified as long-range reconnaissance patrols. These patrols were different from anything the Americans were doing. While US forces typically operated with platoon or company strength, making enough noise to be heard from kilometers away, the Australians moved in tiny groups, silent as shadows. They carried minimal equipment, wrapped their weapons in cloth to prevent any metallic sound, wore soft-soled boots, or went barefoot entirely. They communicated through hand signals that had been refined over years of bush operations. And they stayed out for periods that would have seemed suicidal to American commanders, sometimes 10 days or more, eating cold rations, never lighting fires, sleeping in shifts of 2 hours while the rest watched the darkness. But the patrols themselves were not the weapon. The patrols were merely the delivery system. The weapon was what they left behind. The first confirmed ghost site was discovered by a Viet Cong supply column in April of 1966, and the report filed by the surviving members reads like something from a horror novel. The column, 12 men carrying rice and ammunition to a base camp in the Long High Hills, had stopped for a rest break along a trail they had used dozens of times before. The trail was considered safe, well within Viet Cong-controlled territory, far from known Australian positions. The men sat down, opened their water canteens, and looked up to see a tableau that would haunt their nightmares for the rest of their lives. Hanging from the trees ahead were 3 bodies, positioned in a triangle formation. Each body had been stripped naked. Each body had its eyes open. Each body had a small incision in the chest, directly over the heart, from which a trickle of dried blood had run. But there was no blood on the ground beneath them. There were no tracks leading to or from the site. There were no bullet holes, no shrapnel wounds, no indication of how these men had perished. And around each body's neck hung a small cloth bag containing a single item that made the column commander drop to his knees in terror. The bags contained human teeth. This was not random. This was not improvised. This was the product of months of research into Vietnamese folk beliefs, conducted by Australian intelligence officers who had studied anthropology before they had studied warfare. The tooth, in many Vietnamese traditions, was the seat of the soul. A person who lost their teeth in life was believed to have a weakened spirit. A person whose teeth were taken after passing was condemned to an existence of perpetual suffering, unable to rest, unable to find peace, forced to wander between worlds for eternity. The Viet Cong fighters looking at those bodies understood this instantly. Their communist training told them this was enemy propaganda, a crude psychological trick. But their grandmother's voice, the one that had sung them to sleep with stories of the forest spirits, told them something else entirely. And this was merely the beginning of the nightmare. The reports began filtering into Viet Cong Regional Command within weeks, and the pattern was always the same. Patrols would disappear without a trace, only to be found days later, positioned in ways that defied military logic but spoke directly to Vietnamese supernatural beliefs. Bodies were found sitting upright in circles, facing inward, as though conducting some ghostly meeting. Bodies were found hanging from trees by their own belts, their boots removed and placed at the base of the tree in a specific pattern that corresponded to burial rituals from the Nguyen dynasty. Bodies were found with no visible wounds, no explanation for their passing, their faces frozen in expressions of pure terror. And always, there were the small details that transformed these scenes from mere atrocities into something far more psychologically devastating. The incense sticks placed at cardinal points around the bodies. The small mirrors positioned to reflect moonlight onto the faces of the fallen. The offerings of rice and fruit that appeared to have been partially consumed, as though the spirits had already begun to feed. The Australians had done their homework with terrifying thoroughness. But what made these operations so effective was not merely the staging. It was the fact that the Australians were never seen, never heard, never detected. The Viet Cong knew, intellectually, that these could not be the work of actual spirits. But the alternative explanation was somehow more frightening, because if these were not ghosts, then they were men who could move through the jungle like ghosts, who could enter Viet Cong territory at will, who could eliminate entire patrols without a single shot being heard, without a single alarm being raised, without leaving a single footprint. The Viet Cong had grown accustomed to American tactics, to the roar of helicopter rotors, to the thunder of artillery, to the predictable patterns of search and destroy operations. The Americans were dangerous, yes, but they were understandable. They were loud. They announced their presence. You could prepare for them, hide from them, survive them. These Australians were something else entirely. These Australians were phantoms. The effect on Viet Cong morale was catastrophic, and the evidence is preserved in captured documents that the Pentagon classified for 5 decades. One document, a political officer's report from May of 1966, describes widespread panic among fighters assigned to Phuoc Tuy province. The officer complains that men are refusing to patrol certain areas, claiming the forest there is occupied by angry spirits. He notes that several fighters have deserted entirely, citing supernatural danger as their reason. He recommends additional political education to combat feudal superstition, but admits that previous efforts have been largely unsuccessful. Another document, a letter intercepted by Australian Signals Intelligence, reveals the personal toll of the psychological campaign. A young Viet Cong soldier writes to his mother that he has not slept in 4 days because he is afraid to close his eyes. He describes finding his comrades arranged in a circle, their eyes open, their mouths stuffed with leaves from the sacred Bodhi tree. He begs his mother to send him a protective amulet from the temple in his village, because the demons here are stronger than any I have known. The Australians were not merely eliminating enemies. They were eliminating the enemy's will to fight. By the summer of 1966, the psychological operation had evolved into something far more sophisticated than simple body staging. The SAS teams had begun incorporating acoustic elements into their terror campaign, and the results exceeded anything the planners had anticipated. Australian scientists had recorded the sounds of jungle animals, then modified them, slowing them down, speeding them up, layering multiple recordings together to create noises that sounded almost natural but were subtly, disturbingly wrong. These recordings were played through small speakers hidden in the jungle, usually at night, usually in areas where Viet Cong patrols were known to operate. The sounds were designed to trigger primal fear responses, to make the lizard brain scream that something was very, very wrong. A gibbon's call, stretched to twice its normal length, became a moan of supernatural anguish. A barking deer's alarm cry, reversed and echoed, became the wail of a tormented spirit. And mixed in with these animal sounds were whispers, just barely audible, speaking Vietnamese phrases that had been carefully selected for maximum psychological impact. Names of dead Viet Cong fighters. Pleas for burial rites. Warnings that the forest was angry. The Americans had tried something similar with their Wandering Soul tapes, recordings of ghostly voices played from helicopters to terrify enemy forces. But the American effort was clumsy, obvious, delivered with typical US subtlety, by loudspeakers that could be heard for miles. The Viet Cong quickly learned to recognize and ignore it. The Australian version was something else entirely. The sounds came from nowhere identifiable. They seemed to emanate from the jungle itself. They were quiet enough that a fighter could never be sure he had actually heard them. And they came at irregular intervals, sometimes weeks apart, just often enough to keep the fear alive without becoming predictable. But the acoustic campaign was only one element of the expanding operation. The Australians had also begun leaving what they called calling cards, small objects placed along trails and near Viet Cong positions that served no tactical purpose but tremendous psychological effect. The most common calling card was the Ace of Spades, a choice that requires some explanation. American units had adopted the Ace of Spades as a symbol of destruction, leaving the cards on enemy bodies as a form of psychological warfare. The Americans believed, incorrectly, that Vietnamese culture associated the Ace of Spades with misfortune. In reality, the card had no particular significance in Vietnamese tradition. But the Australians adapted the concept, combining the card with elements that did carry weight in Vietnamese folk belief. The Australian Ace of Spades was hand-painted with symbols from Vietnamese funeral rites. It was attached to a small bundle of incense and a sliver of bone that the SAS had collected from various sources. And it was left not on bodies, but in unexpected places, tacked to trees along trails, tucked into the supports of bridges, placed at the entrances to tunnels. Finding one of these cards meant that the Australian ghosts had been there, had seen you, had chosen not to eliminate you this time. The implication was unmistakable. You were being watched. You were being stalked. Your life continued only because something in the darkness had decided to let you live. The calling cards proved devastatingly effective, but they represented only the visible portion of a much larger psychological architecture. What truly set the Australian operation apart from any previous psychological warfare campaign was the integration of intelligence gathering with terror tactics. The SAS teams were not simply creating scary scenes and hoping for the best. They were systematically mapping Viet Cong psychology, identifying which specific fears were most potent, and tailoring their operations accordingly. Australian intelligence officers interrogated prisoners with questions that seemed strange to their American counterparts. What did the prisoner's grandmother believe about spirits? What stories had he heard about the forest as a child? What did his village do to appease the dead? The answers to these questions were compiled into what the Australians called the Fear Index, a classified document that rated various supernatural beliefs by their psychological potency. At the top of the index were beliefs related to improper burial, the wandering dead, and demonic possession. These became the primary themes of the Ghost Battalion operations. The interrogation program also yielded unexpected intelligence about which Australian tactics were having the greatest effect. Prisoners frequently mentioned the silent ones in their interrogations, describing Australian patrols with a mixture of fear and something approaching awe. One captured political officer provided detailed testimony about the psychological damage the ghost operations were causing, estimating that morale in his district had fallen by 60% since the Australians arrived. He also revealed something that the Australian command found both useful and deeply satisfying. The Viet Cong, he said, had begun calling the Australians Rung, which translated roughly as jungle ghosts or forest demons. It was not a term of respect or admiration. It was a term of genuine supernatural dread, and the name would prove prophetic in ways no one could have anticipated. The most controversial aspect of the Ghost Battalion operations involved the use of what the SAS called live theatre. And this is where the historical record becomes murky, contested, and in some cases deliberately obscured. The essence of live theatre was simple but disturbing. Rather than simply staging scenes for the enemy to discover afterward, the Australians would create situations where Viet Cong fighters would witness seemingly supernatural events in real time. The most common technique involved a lone Australian operator, face painted in patterns designed to resemble Vietnamese representations of the dead, appearing briefly at the edge of a Viet Cong camp in the middle of the night. The operator would not attack. He would simply stand there, silent and motionless, until someone noticed him. The moment a fighter raised the alarm, the operator would vanish into the jungle without a sound. The entire encounter would last perhaps 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds would be enough to convince entire units that they had seen something not of this world. Variations on this technique became increasingly elaborate as the campaign progressed. One operation, documented in after-action reports that were classified for nearly 50 years, involved 4 SAS operators, creating the illusion of a ghost procession near a Viet Cong base camp. The operators had studied Vietnamese funeral customs in detail, learning the specific patterns of movement, the postures, the sounds associated with spirit processions in local folklore. Just before dawn, they emerged from the jungle in single file, moving with the slow, gliding gait that Vietnamese tradition associated with the walking dead. They wore white, the color of mourning and death in Vietnamese culture, and their faces were painted to resemble corpses. They passed within 50 meters of the base camp, visible to the sentries, but far enough away that their human features were impossible to distinguish in the pre-dawn darkness. They made no sound except for a low, rhythmic chant in Vietnamese, words from ancient funeral rites that one of the operators had memorized from a captured prayer book. And then they disappeared into the morning mist, leaving behind nothing but the terrified screams of the sentries and a base camp that would be abandoned by nightfall. The live theatre operations were spectacularly effective, but they were also spectacularly dangerous. Unlike conventional SAS operations, which emphasized avoiding contact with the enemy at all costs, live theatre required operators to deliberately reveal themselves, to come within detection range of armed fighters who might react with gunfire rather than superstitious terror. Several operations nearly resulted in Australian casualties when enemy fighters overcame their fear and opened fire. One operator took a round through his poncho during a ghost procession, missing his torso by inches. Another was forced to eliminate a sentry who discovered him during a stationary haunting, compromising the supernatural illusion and requiring the team to extract under fire. The risks were significant enough that command eventually restricted live theatre operations to specific circumstances, requiring detailed intelligence about target unit psychology before approval would be granted. But the effectiveness of the technique kept it in the Australian playbook throughout the war. And then came the operation that would cement the Ma Rung legend forever. The date was October of 1966, and Australian intelligence had identified a significant Viet Cong force gathering in the Long Hai Hills, perhaps 300 fighters preparing for a major offensive against the task force base at Nui, Dat. The Americans, informed of the gathering, wanted to hit it with B-52 strikes to simply erase the threat with overwhelming firepower. But the Australians had a different idea. They proposed what they called Operation Phantom, a psychological strike designed not to eliminate the enemy force, but to shatter it psychologically, to send 300 fighters fleeing into the jungle in such a state of terror that they would be useless for months. American commanders were skeptical. 300 fighters was a substantial force, too large to be intimidated by a handful of SAS operators playing Ghost. But the Australians were confident. They had been studying this specific unit for weeks, interrogating prisoners, intercepting communications, building a detailed profile of its fears and vulnerabilities. And they had found a pressure point that they believed could break the entire unit. The key was the unit commander, a man whose name appears in Australian records only as Target Alpha. Intelligence suggested that Target Alpha was personally terrified of the supernatural, despite being a communist political officer who was supposed to reject such beliefs. Intercepted letters to his wife revealed that he had been having nightmares about spirits since arriving in Phuoc Tuy, that he carried protective amulets despite the political consequences if they were discovered, and that he had secretly conducted Buddhist rituals to ward off the MA he believed were hunting him. The Australians decided to give Target Alpha exactly what he feared most. But this operation would require resources and coordination unlike anything the Ghost Battalion had attempted before. The setup began 2 weeks before the main operation, with SAS teams infiltrating the area around the Viet Cong encampment and preparing what they called environmental staging. This involved dozens of small modifications to the jungle itself, changes subtle enough that they would not be immediately noticed, but disturbing enough that they would gradually build an atmosphere of dread. Strips of white cloth, the color of Vietnamese mourning, were tied to branches in patterns that corresponded to funeral rituals. Small effigies made of jungle materials were placed at intervals along trails, their features crude but recognizable as representations of the dead. Shallow pits were dug and then covered with leaves, creating soft spots in the earth that would feel, to a fighter walking over them, like stepping on freshly turned grave soil. And throughout the staging area, the Australians placed their signature calling cards, the painted aces of spades with their bone slivers and incense bundles. The Viet Cong fighters noticed the changes gradually, and the effect was exactly what the Australians intended. Sentries began reporting strange feelings, a sense of being watched, a conviction that something was wrong with the forest. Fighters found the effigies and the calling cards, reporting them to their officers with increasing alarm. Target Alpha, receiving these reports, became visibly agitated, though he tried to hide his reaction behind political rhetoric about superstition and feudal thinking. But his men saw the fear in his eyes. They saw him clutching the amulets hidden beneath his uniform. They saw him avoiding certain parts of the encampment, the places where the strange white cloths had been found. And they began to share his fear. The main operation launched on the night of October the 23rd, 1966, and what happened over the following 6 hours would become legend among Australian Special Forces veterans. At precisely midnight, 4 SAS teams, 16 operators in total, began their approach to the Viet Cong encampment from 4 different directions. Each team carried specialized equipment prepared specifically for this operation, equipment that had never been used in combat before. The teams moved with excruciating slowness, covering the final of 500 meters to the perimeter over a period of 3 hours. They made no sound, they left no trace. And when they finally reached their positions, they waited, motionless in the darkness, for the signal to begin. The first phase was acoustic. At 3 in the morning, the jungle around the encampment came alive with sounds that no human ear should ever hear. The recordings had been prepared by Australian scientists working from captured descriptions of spirit phenomena, layering animal calls with whispered Vietnamese, adding frequencies at the edge of human hearing that created sensations of nausea and disorientation. The sounds seemed to come from everywhere at once, impossible to locate, impossible to escape. Sentries began shouting the alarm, but there was nothing to shoot at, nothing to fight, only the darkness and the terrible sounds emerging from it. Phase 2 began 30 minutes later, after the acoustic barrage had softened the target. SAS operators began igniting small pyrotechnic devices that had been positioned throughout the staging area during the previous weeks. The devices produced no explosion, no loud report, only a sudden flare of green light that lasted perhaps 2 seconds before fading. Green, in Vietnamese tradition, was associated with corpse light, the glow said to emanate from the bodies of the recently deceased. The flares appeared randomly, unpredictably, sometimes close to the perimeter, sometimes in the distance, creating the illusion of dozens of spirits converging on the camp from all directions. But it was Phase 3 that broke them. Target Alpha's command post was located in the center of the encampment, a position chosen for security, surrounded by his most trusted fighters. At precisely 4 in the morning, as the acoustic barrage and the corpse lights reached their crescendo, something appeared at the edge of the command post clearing. The fighters on guard described it as a figure, human in shape, but wrong in every other respect. It was dressed in white, its face painted the color of death, its movements slow and gliding in the manner of Vietnamese funeral processions. It did not attack. It did not speak. It simply stood at the edge of the darkness, looking directly at Target Alpha's position, with eyes that reflected the green light like mirrors. And then it raised one hand and pointed. Not at the fighters, not at the camp, at Target Alpha himself. What happened next would be debated by military historians for decades. The official Vietnamese account, released years after the war, claims that the encampment came under heavy Australian attack, and that the fighters withdrew in good order to avoid casualties. The Australian after-action report tells a different story. It describes spontaneous disintegration of enemy unit cohesion, with fighters fleeing in all directions, abandoning weapons, abandoning supplies, abandoning their wounded. It describes Target Alpha being physically dragged from his command post by his subordinates, screaming in Vietnamese about demons and ancestors and debts that could never be repaid. It describes the SAS teams watching in astonishment as 300 trained fighters dissolved into a panicked mob without a single shot being fired. And in the cold morning light, the Australians found something that would never appear in any official report. Among the abandoned equipment and scattered supplies, they found Target Alpha's personal effects, including a diary that the intelligence officers would study for months. The diary revealed a man whose facade of communist rationalism had been crumbling for weeks, a man who had been fighting a private war against beliefs he could not shake. He wrote about the Rung with genuine terror, describing them not as enemy soldiers, but as spirits of vengeance, ghosts of all the people who had perished in this war returning to collect their due. He wrote about dreams where faceless figures pointed at him, just as the figure had pointed at him in the final moments before his nerve broke. And he wrote, in the final entry dated the afternoon before the operation, that he knew they were coming for him, that he could feel their eyes on him even in daylight, that no amount of political education could protect him from what he had done. The diary was classified immediately. It remained classified until 2012. Operation Phantom became the template for subsequent Ghost Battalion activities, though nothing would ever quite match its spectacular success. Over the following 2 years, Australian SAS teams conducted hundreds of psychological operations throughout Phuoc Tuy province, creating a network of fear that extended far beyond the immediate tactical effects. Viet Cong units began avoiding the province entirely, requesting reassignment to areas where they would face American forces instead. The logic was perverse, but understandable. The Americans were dangerous, yes, but they were comprehensible. They fought with bullets and bombs, with things that could be seen and heard and potentially survived. The Australians fought with something else entirely. The Australians fought with nightmares. The statistics tell part of the story. Those statistics cannot capture the full psychological impact of the campaign. During the entire Vietnam deployment, Australian forces suffered 521 fatalities, a tragic number but a fraction of what the Americans experienced proportionally. Australian SAS specifically recorded only 2 combat fatalities during the entire war, despite conducting some of the most dangerous operations in the theatre. Meanwhile, estimated Viet Cong casualties in areas where Ghost Battalion operated ran into the thousands, with additional thousands deserting or requesting transfer. The kill ratio was unlike anything seen in modern warfare, and when Pentagon analysts finally got access to the Australian records, they could barely believe what they were reading. But the Pentagon's reaction to the Ghost Battalion operations was not what the Australians expected, and this is where the story takes its darkest turn. American commanders, upon learning the details of Australian psychological operations, did not respond with admiration or requests for collaboration. They responded with alarm, with accusations, with demands that the operations cease immediately. The specific objection was never put in writing, at least not in any document that has been declassified. But the Australian officers who participated in the meetings reported the American position clearly. The Ghost Battalion operations, according to the Americans, violated the Geneva Conventions. They constituted psychological torture. They amounted to terrorism. And most critically, they made the Americans look bad. This last point was never officially stated, but every Australian officer understood it. The Ghost Battalion's success highlighted American failure. It demonstrated that the war could be fought effectively with small numbers and subtle methods, that overwhelming firepower was not the only answer. It suggested that the American approach, with its body counts and free fire zones and carpet bombing, was not merely brutal, but ineffective. And in 1967, with American casualties mounting and public support for the war collapsing, the last thing the Pentagon wanted was evidence that a handful of Australians had found a better way. The pressure on Australian commanders to discontinue psychological operations intensified throughout 1967, and by early 1968. The Ghost Battalion program had been officially terminated. The records were classified. The participants were instructed never to discuss their activities. And the most successful psychological warfare campaign of the Vietnam War was consigned to the shadows of history, where it would remain for nearly 50 years. But the Ma Rung legend did not die with the program. It grew. Vietnamese veterans of the war continued to speak of the jungle ghosts long after the last Australian helicopter lifted off from Nui Dat. Stories circulated through refugee communities, passed from grandfather to grandchild, evolving with each telling until the Ma Rung became something more than mere soldiers. They became mythology. In some versions, the Ma Rung were spirits of Australian soldiers who had perished in previous wars, returning to fight alongside their living comrades. In others, they were ancient forest demons that the Australians had somehow learned to summon and control. In still others, they were not supernatural beings at all, but the result of Australian soldiers making pacts with dark forces, trading their souls for the ability to move unseen through the jungle. These stories were not believed literally by educated Vietnamese, but they persisted nonetheless. Evidence of the deep psychological wound the Ghost Battalion had inflicted. The legacy of the Ghost Battalion extends far beyond Vietnam, though this influence has been deliberately obscured. American Special Forces, despite officially rejecting Australian methods during the war, quietly studied them afterward. Elements of the Ghost Battalion playbook appeared in psychological operations during the Contra War in Nicaragua, during the Gulf War, during operations in Somalia and Afghanistan. The specific techniques evolved, adapted to different cultures and different conflicts, but the core principle remained the same. Fear, properly weaponized, was more effective than any firearm. Terror, systematically applied, could defeat enemies that bombs and bullets could not touch. The Australian SAS veterans who participated in Ghost Battalion operations have maintained their silence for decades, bound by classification and by their own complicated feelings about what they did. Some consider the program their finest achievement, a demonstration of skill and psychological sophistication that saved countless lives on both sides. Others are troubled by methods that, however effective, crossed lines that soldiers should not cross. And some simply refuse to discuss it, changing the subject with a look that suggests memories too complex for words. The question that historians continue to debate is whether the Ghost Battalion was a legitimate military innovation or something darker, a descent into psychological warfare so extreme that it constitutes a kind of moral violation regardless of its effectiveness. The supporters argue that the program saved lives, that breaking enemy morale was more humane than breaking enemy bodies, that a fighter who flees in terror is a fighter who does not need to be destroyed. The critics counter that weaponizing cultural beliefs, manipulating religious fears, staging scenes designed to inflict maximum psychological trauma, represents a form of warfare that degrades everyone involved, victim and perpetrator alike. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the shadows between these positions. What cannot be disputed is the effectiveness of the Ghost Battalion program, an effectiveness that the Pentagon spent decades trying to ignore and eventually to classify into oblivion. 500 Australian SAS operators held a province that should have required 5,000. They achieved a casualty ratio that defied mathematical logic. They broke enemy units without firing shots, captured objectives without launching assaults, won battles through the manipulation of pure terror. And they did it all so quietly, so invisibly, so completely in accordance with their training as jungle ghosts, that half a century would pass before the full story could be told. The village elders in Viet-Cong province still warn their grandchildren about the forest. They do not speak of soldiers or armies or the political complexities of a war that ended before their grandchildren were born. They speak of the Rung, the spirits that walked in the jungle when the night was darkest, the demons that could appear and disappear without sound, the ghosts that carried weapons but seemed beyond the reach of any bullet. And when their grandchildren laugh at these stories, dismiss them as superstitious remnants of a less enlightened age, the elders simply shake their heads. They were there. They remember the terror. And they know, in the deepest parts of their souls where belief is stronger than reason, that something walked those jungles that was not entirely human. Whether that something was Australian soldiers using sophisticated psychological techniques, or something else entirely, they cannot say. They only know that they fear it still. The final declassification of Ghost Battalion records in 2020 revealed one last detail that had been hidden even from most of the participants. The program, it turned out, had not ended in 1968 after all. It had simply gone deeper underground, transformed into something even more classified, even more invisible. References in the declassified documents pointed to a successor program, codenamed Dark Harvest, that continued Australian psychological operations in Vietnam until the final withdrawal in 1972. The details of Dark Harvest remain classified to this day, protected by security classifications that will not expire until the last participant is gone. When questioned about the program, Australian defence officials respond with no comment. When journalists file freedom of information requests, they receive heavily redacted documents that reveal nothing of substance. Whatever the Australians learned in the jungles of Vietnam, whatever techniques they perfected in those years of ghostly warfare, apparently remains valuable enough to protect even now, more than half a century later. And that, perhaps, is the most disturbing legacy of the Ghost Battalion. Not what we know about what they did, but what we still do not know, and may never know, about what they became. The Rung walked the jungles of Vietnam, And somewhere, in some form, they walk still.